Hello and welcome to the Short Story Workshop. In each episode, we read a short story and then discuss it. I'm here with Matt and Simone, and this week's story is The Shadow and the Flash by Jack London. I picked this story. I picked it because it's ridiculous, and also I thought it might be a good one because it has two things which I know each of you care about, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Matt, you're quite into weird science, and Simone, you like rivalries, so I thought this might be a good one to discuss, even if you hated it, I suppose.
I love a rivalry.
You've got us pegged.
Yep. It's
so nice of you trying to find stories we'd actually like, unlike me, who's like, oh, what can I make them really hate?
All right, here is The Shadow and the Flash by Jack London.
When I look back, I realise what a peculiar friendship it was. First there was Lloyd Inwood, tall, slender, and finely knit, nervous and dark. And then Paul Tyclon, tall, slender, and finely knit, nervous and blonde. Each was a replica of the other in everything except colour. Lloyd's eyes were black, Paul's were blue. Under stress of excitement, the blood coursed olive in the face of Lloyd, crimson in the face of Paul. But outside this matter of colouring, they were as like as two peas. Both were high-strung, prone to excessive tension and endurance, and they lived at concert pitch. But there was a trio involved in this remarkable friendship, and the third was short and fat and chunky and lazy, and loath to say, it was I. Paul and Lloyd seemed born to rival with each other, and I to be peacemaker between them. We grew up together, the three of us, and full often I have received angry blows each intended for the other. They were always competing, striving to outdo each other, and when entered upon some such struggle there was no limit either to their endeavours or passions. This intense spirit of rivalry obtained in their studies and their games. If Paul memorised one canto of Marmion, Lloyd memorised 2 cantos. Paul came back with 3, and Lloyd again with 4, till each knew the whole poem by heart. I remember an incident that occurred at the swimming hole, an incident tragically significant of the life struggle between them. The boys had a game of diving to the bottom of a 10-foot pool and holding on by submerged roots to see who could stay under the longest. Paul and Lloyd allowed themselves to be bantered into making the descent together. When I saw their faces, set and determined, disappear in the water as they sank swiftly down, I felt a foreboding of something dreadful. The moment sped, the ripples died away, the face of the pool grew placid and untroubled, and neither black nor golden head broke surface in quest of air. We above grew anxious. The longest record of the longest-winded boy had been exceeded, and still there was no sign. Air bubbles trickled slowly upward, showing that the breath had been expelled from their lungs, and after that the bubbles ceased to trickle upward. Each second became interminable, and, unable longer to endure the suspense, I plunged into the water. I found them down at the bottom, clutching tight to the roots, their heads not a foot apart, their eyes wide open, each glaring fixedly at the other. They were suffering frightful torment, writhing and twisting in pangs of voluntary suffocation, for neither would let go and acknowledge himself beaten. I tried to break Paul's hold on the root, but he resisted me fiercely. Then I lost my breath and came to the surface, badly scared. I quickly explained the situation, and 6 of us went down, and by main strength tore them loose. By the time we got them out, both were unconscious, and it was only after much barrel rolling and rubbing and pounding that they finally came to their senses. They would have drowned there had no one rescued them. When Paul Tyclon entered college, he let it be generally understood that he was going in for the social sciences. Lloyd Inwood, entering at the same time, elected to take the same course. But Paul had had it secretly in mind all the time to study the natural sciences, specialising in chemistry, and at the last moment he switched over. Though Lloyd had already arranged his year's work and attended the first lectures, he had once followed Paul's lead and went into the natural sciences, and especially for chemistry. Their rivalry soon became a noted thing throughout the university. Each was a spur to the other, and they went into chemistry deeper than any student ever before. So deep, in fact, that ere they took their sheepskins they could have stumped any chemistry or cow college professor in the institution, save old Moss, head of the department, and even him they puzzled and edified more than once. Lloyd's discovery of the death bacillus of the sea toad, and his experiments on it with potassium cyanide sent his name and that of his university ringing round the world. Nor was Paul a whit behind. When he succeeded in producing laboratory colloids exhibiting amoeba-like activities, and when he cast new light upon the processes of fertilization through his startling experiments with simple sodium chlorides and magnesium solutions on low forms of marine life. It was in their undergraduate days, however, in the midst of their profoundest plunges into the mysteries of organic chemistry, that Doris van Benschoten entered into their lives. Lloyd met her first, but within 24 hours Paul saw to it that he also made her acquaintance. Of course, they fell in love with her, and she became the only thing in life worth living for. They wooed her with equal ardour and fire, and so intense became their struggle for her that half the student body took to wagering wildly on the result. Even old Moss, one day, after an astounding demonstration in his private laboratory by Paul, was guilty to the extent of a month's salary of backing him to become the bridegroom of Doris van Benschoten. In the end, she solved the problem in her own way, to everybody's satisfaction except Paul's and Lloyd's. Getting them together, she said that she really could not choose between them because she loved them both equally well, and that, unfortunately, since polyandry was not permitted in the United States, she would be compelled to forgo the honour and happiness of marrying either of them. Each blamed the other for this lamentable outcome, and the bitterness between them grew more bitter. But things came to a head enough. It was at my home, after they had taken their degrees and dropped out of the world's sight, that the beginning of the end came to pass. Both were men of means, with little inclination and no necessity for professional life. My friendship and their mutual animosity were the two things that linked them in any way together. While they were very often at my place, they made it a fastidious point to avoid each other on such visits, though it was inevitable, under the circumstances, that they should come upon each other occasionally. On the day I have in recollection, Paul Tyclorn had been mooning all morning in my study over a current scientific review. This left me free to my own affairs, and I was out among my roses when Lloyd Inwood arrived. Clipping and pruning and tacking the climbers on the porch, with my mouth full of nails, and Lloyd following me about and lending a hand now and again, we fell to discussing the mythical race of invisible people, that strange and vagrant people, the traditions of which have come down to us. Lloyd warmed to the talk in his nervous, jerky fashion, and was soon interrogating the physical properties and possibilities of invisibility. A perfectly black object, he contended, would elude and defy the acutest vision. Colour is a sensation, he was saying. It has no objective reality. Without light, we can see neither colours nor objects themselves. All objects are black in the dark, and in the dark it is impossible to see them. If no light strikes upon them, then no light is flung back from them to the eye, and so we have no vision evidence of their being. But we see black objects in daylight, I objected. Very true, he went on warmly. And that is because they are not perfectly black. Were they perfectly black, absolutely black, as it were, we could not see them. Aye, not in the blaze of 1,000 suns could we see them. And so I say, with the right pigments, properly compounded, an absolutely black paint could be produced, which would render invisible whatever it was applied to. It would be a remarkable discovery, I said non-committally, but the whole thing seemed too fantastic for aught but speculative purposes. Remarkable? Lloyd slapped me on the shoulder. I should say so. Why, old chap, to coat myself with such a paint would be to put the world at my feet. The secrets of kings and courts would be mine, the machinations of diplomats and politicians, the play of stock gamblers, the plans of trusts and corporations. I could keep my hand on the inner pulse of things and become the greatest power in the world. And I... He broke off shortly, then added, well, I have begun my experiments, and I don't mind telling you that I'm right in line for it. A laugh from the doorway startled us. Paul Tyclorn was standing there, a smile of mockery on his lips. You forget, my dear Lloyd, he said. Forget what? You forget, Paul went on. You forget the shadow. I saw Lloyd's face drop, but he answered sneeringly, I can carry a sunshade, you know. Then he turned suddenly and fiercely upon him. Look here, Paul, you'll keep out of this if you know what's good for you. A rupture seemed imminent, but Paul laughed good-naturedly. I wouldn't lay fingers on your dirty pigments. Succeed beyond your most sanguine expectations, yet you will always fetch up against the shadow. You can't get away from it. Now, I shall go on the very opposite tack. In the very nature of my proposition, the shadow will be eliminated. Transparency? Objected Lloyd instantly. But it can't be achieved. Oh no, of course not. And Paul shrugged his shoulders and strolled off down the Briar path. This was the beginning of it. Both men attacked the problem with all the tremendous energy for which they were noted, and with a rancour and bitterness that made me tremble for the success of either. Each trusted me to the utmost, and in the long weeks of experimentation that followed, I was made a party to both sides, listening to their theorizings and witnessing their demonstrations. Never, by word or sign, did I convey to either the slightest hint of the other's progress, and they respected me for the seal I put upon my lips. Lloyd Inward, after prolonged and unintermittent application, when the tension upon his mind and body became too great to bear, had a strange way of attaining relief. He attended prize fights. It was at one of these brutal exhibitions, whither he had dragged me in order to tell his latest results, that his theory received striking confirmation. Do you see that red-whiskered man? He said, pointing across the ring to the fifth tier of seats on the opposite side. And do you see the man next to him, the one in the white hat? Well, there is quite a gap between them, is there not? Certainly, I answered. They are a seat apart. The gap is the unoccupied seat. He leaned over to me and spoke seriously. Between the red-whiskered man and the white-hatted man sits Ben Wasson. You have heard me speak of him. He is the cleverest pugilist of his weight in the country. He is also a Caribbean Negro, full-blooded and the blackest in the United States. He has on a black overcoat buttoned up. I saw him when he came in and took that seat. As soon as he sat down, he disappeared. Watch closely. He may smile. I was for crossing over to verify Lloyd's statement, but he restrained me. Wait, he said. I waited and watched, till the red-whiskered man turned his head as though addressing the unoccupied seat. And then, in that empty space, I saw the rolling whites of a pair of eyes and the white double crescent of 2 rows of teeth, and for the instant I could make out a Negro's face. But with the passing of the smile his visibility passed, and the chair seemed vacant as before. Were he perfectly black, you could sit alongside him and not see him, Lloyd said. And I confess the illustration was apt enough to make me well nigh convinced. I visited Lloyd's laboratory a number of times after that, and found him always deep in his search after the absolute black. His experiments covered all sorts of pigments, such as lamp blacks, tars, carbonized vegetable matters, suits of oil and fats, and the various carbonized animal substances. White light is constructed of the 7 primary colours, he argued to me, but it is itself, of itself, invisible. Only by being reflected from objects do it and the objects become visible, but only that portion of it that is reflected becomes visible. For instance, here is a blue tobacco box. The white light strikes against it, and with one exception, all its component colours, violet, indigo, green, yellow, orange and red, all are absorbed. The one exception is blue. It is not absorbed, but reflected. Therefore, the tobacco box gives us a sensation of blueness. We do not see the other colours because they are absorbed. We see only the blue. For the same reason, grass is green. The green waves of white light are thrown upon our eyes. When we paint our houses, we do not apply colour to them, he said at another time. What we do is apply certain substances that have the property of absorbing from white light all the colours except those that we would have our houses appear. When a substance reflects all the colours to the eye, it seems to us white. When it absorbs all the colours, it is black. But as I said before, we have as yet no perfect black. All the colours are not absorbed. The perfect black, guarding against high lights, will be utterly and absolutely invisible. Look at that, for example. He pointed to the palette lying on his work table. Different shades of black pigment were brushed on it. One in particular I could hardly see. It gave my eyes a blurring sensation, and I rubbed them and looked again. "That," he said impressively, "is the blackest black you or any mortal man ever looked upon. But just you wait, and I'll have a black so black that no mortal man will be able to look upon it and see it." On the other hand, I used to find Paul Cyclone plunged as deeply into the study of light polarization, diffraction and interference, single and double refraction, and all manner of strange organic compounds. "Transparency, a state or quality of body which permits all rays of light to pass through," he defined for me. "That is what I am seeking." Lloyd blunders up against the shadow with his perfect opaqueness, but I escape it. A transparent body casts no shadow, neither does it reflect light waves, that is, the perfectly transparent does not. So, avoiding highlights, not only will such a body cast no shadow, but since it reflects no light, it will also be invisible. We were standing by the window at another time. Paul was engaged in polishing a number of lenses, which were ranged along the sill. Suddenly, after a pause in the conversation, he said, "Oh, I've dropped a lens. Stick your head out, old man, and see where it went to." Out I started to thrust my head, but a sharp blow on the forehead caused me to recoil. I rubbed my bruised brow and gazed with reproachful inquiry at Paul, who was laughing in gleeful, boyish fashion. "Well?" he said. "Well?" I echoed. "Why don't you investigate?" he demanded. And investigate I did. Before thrusting out my head, my senses, automatically active, had told me there was nothing there, that nothing intervened between me and out of doors, that the aperture of the window opening was utterly empty. I stretched forth my hand and felt a hard object, smooth and cool and flat, which my touch, out of his experience, told me to be glass. I looked again, but could see positively nothing. "White quartzo sand," Paul rattled off. "Sodic carbonate, slaked lime, cutlet, manganese peroxide. There you have it. The finest French plate glass, made by the great Saint Gobain Company, who made the finest plate glass in the world, and this is the finest piece they ever made. It cost a king's ransom, but look at it. You can't see it. You don't know it's there till you run your head against it. Hey, old boy, that's merely an object lesson. Certain elements, in themselves opaque, yet so compounded as to give a resultant body which is transparent. But that is a matter of inorganic chemistry, you say. Very true, but I dare to assert, standing here on my 2 feet, that in the organic I can duplicate whatever occurs in the inorganic. Here!" He held a test tube between me and the light, and I noted the cloudy or muddy liquid it contained. He emptied the contents of another test tube into it, and almost instantly it became clear and sparkling. "Or here!" With quick, nervous movements amongst his array of test tubes, he turned a white solution to a wine colour and a light yellow solution to a dark brown. He dropped a piece of litmus paper into an acid, when it changed instantly to red, and on floating it in an alkali, it turned as quickly to blue. "The litmus paper is still the litmus paper," he enunciated in the formal manner of the lecturer. "I have not changed it into something else." Then what did I do? I merely changed the arrangement of its molecules. Where, at first, it absorbed all colours from the light but red, its molecular structure was so changed that it absorbed red and all colours except blue. And so it goes ad infinitum. Now, what I propose to do is this. He paused for a space. I propose to seek, and to find, the proper reagents which, acting upon the living organism, will bring about molecular changes analogous to those you have just witnessed. But these reagents, which I shall find, and for that matter upon which I already have my hands, will not turn the living body to blue or red or black, but they will turn it to transparency. All light will pass through it. It will be invisible. It will cast no shadow. A few weeks later, I went hunting with Paul. He had been promising me for some time that I should have the pleasure of shooting over a wonderful dog. The most wonderful dog, in fact, that ever man shot over, so he averred, and continued to aver till my curiosity was aroused. But on the morning in question I was disappointed, for there was no dog in evidence. Don't see him about, Paul remarked unconcernedly, and we set off across the fields. I could not imagine at the time what was ailing me, but I had a feeling of some impending and deadly illness. My nerves were all awry, and from the astounding tricks they played me, my senses seemed to have run riot. Strange sounds disturbed me. At times I heard the swish-swish of grass being shoved aside, and once the patter of feet across a patch of stony ground. "Did you hear anything, Paul?" I asked once. But he shook his head and thrust his feet steadily forward. When climbing a fence, I heard the low, eager whine of a dog, apparently from within a couple of feet of me, but on looking about me, I saw nothing. I dropped to the ground, limp and trembling. "Paul," I said, "we had better return to the house. I'm afraid I'm going to be sick." "Nonsense, old man," he answered. "The sunshine has gone to your head like wine. You'll be all right. It's famous weather." But, passing along a narrow path through a clump of cottonwoods, some object brushed against my legs and I stumbled and nearly fell. I looked with sudden anxiety at Paul. "What's the matter?" he asked. "Tripping over your own feet?" I kept my tongue between my teeth and plodded on, though sore, perplexed, and thoroughly satisfied that some acute and mysterious malady had attacked my nerves. So far my eyes had escaped, but when we got to the open fields again, even my vision went back on me. Strange flashes of vari-coloured rainbow light began to appear and disappear on the path before me. Still, I managed to keep myself in hand till the vari-coloured lights persisted for a space of full 20 seconds, dancing and flashing in continuous play. Then I sat down, weak and shaky. "It's all up with me," I gasped, covering my eyes with my hands. "It has attacked my eyes. Paul, take me home." But Paul laughed long and loud. "What did I tell you? The most wonderful dog, eh? Well, what do you think?" He turned partly from me and began to whistle. I heard the patter of feet, the panting of a heated animal, and the unmistakable yelp of a dog. Then Paul stooped down and apparently fondled the empty air. "Here, give me your fist." And he rubbed my hand over the cold nose and jowls of a dog. A dog it certainly was, with the shape and the smooth, short coat of a pointer. Suffice to say, I speedily recovered my spirits and control. Paul put a collar about the animal's neck and tied his handkerchief to its tail, and then was vouchsafed to us the remarkable sight of an empty collar and a waving handkerchief cavorting over the fields. It was something to see that collar and handkerchief pin a bevy of quail in a clump of locusts and remain rigid and immovable till we had flushed the birds. Now and again the dog emitted the vari-coloured light flashes I have mentioned. The one thing, Paul explained, which he had not anticipated and which he doubted could be overcome. "They're a large family," he said. "These sun dogs, wind dogs, rainbows, halos, and perihelia, they are productions of refraction of light from mineral and ice crystals from mist, rain, spray, and no end of things, and I am afraid they are the penalty I must pay for transparency. I escaped Lloyd's shadow only to fetch up against the rainbow flash." A couple of days later, before the entrance to Paul's laboratory, I encountered a terrible stench. So overpowering was it that it was easy to discover the source, mass of putrescent matter on the doorstep, which in general outlines resembled a dog. Paul was startled when he investigated my find. It was his invisible dog, or rather what had been his invisible dog, for it was now plainly visible. It had been playing about but a few minutes before in all health and strength. Closer examination revealed that the skull had been crushed by some heavy blow. While it was strange that the animal should have been killed, the inexplicable thing was that it should so quickly decay. "The reagents I injected into its system were harmless," Paul explained. "Yet they were powerful, and it appears that when death comes they force practically instantaneous disintegration. Remarkable. Most remarkable. Well, the only thing is not to die. They do not harm so long as one lives. But I do wonder who smashed in that dog's head." Light, however, was thrown upon this when a frightened housemaid brought the news that Gaffer Bedshaw had, that very morning, not more than an hour back, gone violently insane, and was strapped down at home in the huntsman's lodge, where he raved of a battle with a ferocious and gigantic beast that he had encountered in the Tyclone pasture. He claimed that the thing, whatever it was invisible, that with his own eyes he had seen that it was invisible, wherefore his tearful wife and daughters shook their heads, and wherefore he but waxed the more violent, and the gardener and the coachman tightened the straps by another hole. Nor, while Paul Tyclone was thus successfully mastering the problem of invisibility, was Lloyd Inwood a whit behind. I went over in answer to a message of his to come and see how he was getting on. Now, his laboratory occupied an isolated situation in the midst of his vast grounds. It was built in a pleasant little glade, surrounded on all sides by a dense forest growth, and was to be gained by way of a winding and erratic path. But I have travelled that path so often as to know every foot of it, and conceive my surprise when I came upon the glade and found no laboratory. The quaint shed structure with its red soundstone chimney was not, nor did it look as if it ever had been. There were no sign of ruin, no debris, nothing. I started to walk across what had once been its site. This, I said to myself, should be where the step went up to the door. Barely were the words out of my mouth when I stubbed my toe on some obstacle, pitched forward and butted my head into something that felt very much like a door. I reached out my hand. It was a door. I found the knob and turned it, and at once the door swung inward on its hinges, the whole interior of the laboratory impinged upon my vision. Greeting Lloyd, I closed the door and backed up the path a few paces. I could see nothing of the building. Returning and opening the door, at once all the furniture and every detail of the interior were visible. It was indeed startling, the sudden transition from void to light and form and colour. "What do you think of it, eh?" Lloyd asked, wringing my hand. "I slapped a couple of coats of absolute black on the outside yesterday afternoon to see how it worked. How's your head? You bumped it pretty solidly, I imagine." Never mind that," he interrupted my congratulations. "I've something better for you to do." While he talked, he began to strip, and when he stood naked before me, he thrust a pot and brush into my hand and said, "Here, give me a coat of this." It was an oily, shellac-like stuff, which spread quickly and easily over the skin and dried immediately. "Merely preliminary and precautionary," he explained when I had finished. "But now for the real stuff." I picked up another pot he indicated and glanced inside, but could see nothing. "It's empty," I said. "Stick your finger in it." I obeyed and was aware of a sensation of cool moistness. On withdrawing my hand, I glanced at the forefinger, the one I had immersed, but it had disappeared. I moved and knew from the alternate tension and relaxation of the muscles that I moved it, but it defied my sense of sight. To all appearances, I had been shorn of a finger, nor could I get any visual impression of it till I extended it under the skylight and saw its shadow plainly blotted on the floor. Lloyd chuckled. "Now spread it on and keep your eyes open." I dipped the brush into the seemingly empty pot and gave him a long stroke across his chest. With the passage of the brush, the living flesh disappeared from beneath. I covered his right leg, and he was a one-legged man defying all laws of gravitation, and so, stroke by stroke, member by member, I painted Lloyd Inwood into nothingness. It was a creepy experience, and I was glad when naught remained in sight but his burning black eyes, poised apparently unsupported in mid-air. "I have a refined and harmless solution for them," he said. "A fine spray with an airbrush, and presto! I am not." This deftly accomplished, he said, "Now I shall move about, and do you tell me what sensations you experience." "In the first place, I cannot see you," I said, and I could hear his gleeful laugh from the midst of the emptiness. "Of course," I continued, "you cannot escape your shadow, but that was to be expected. When you pass between my eye and an object, the object disappears, but so unusual and incomprehensible was its disappearance that it seems to me as though my eyes had blurred. When you move rapidly, I experience a bewildering succession of blurs. The blurring sensation makes my eyes ache and my brain tired." "Have you any other warnings of my presence?" he asked. "No and yes," I answered. "When you are near me, I have feelings similar to those produced by dank warehouses, gloomy crypts, and deep mines. And as sailors feel the loom of the land on dark nights, so I think I feel the loom of your body. It is all very vague and intangible." Long we talked that last morning in his laboratory, and when I turned to go, He put his unseen hand in mine with nervous grip and said, "Now I shall conquer the world." And I could not dare to tell him of Paul Tyclorn's equal success. At home I found a note from Paul, asking me to come up immediately, and it was high noon when I came spinning up the driveway on my wheel. Paul called me from the tennis court, and I dismounted and went over, but the court was empty. As I stood there, gaping open-mouthed, a tennis ball struck me on the arm, and as I turned about, another whizzed past my ear. For aught I could see of my assailant, they came whirling at me from out of space, and right well was I peppered with them. When the balls already flung at me began to come back for a second whack, I realized the situation. Seizing a racket and keeping my eyes open, I quickly saw a rainbow flash appearing and disappearing and darting over the ground. I took out after it, and when I laid the racket upon it for a half-dozen stout blows, Paul's voice rang out. "Enough, enough! Oh, ouch, stop! You're landing on my naked skin, you know. Ow, ow! I'll be good, I'll be good. I only wanted you to see my metamorphosis," he said ruefully, and I imagined he was rubbing his hurts. A few minutes later we were playing tennis, a handicap on my part, for I could have no knowledge of his position, save when all the angles between himself, the sun, and me were in proper conjunction. Then he flashed, and only then. But the flashes were more brilliant than the rainbow, purest blue, most delicate violet, brightest yellow, and all the intermediary shades, with the scintillant brilliancy of the diamond, dazzling, blinding, iridescent. But in the midst of our play I felt a sudden cold chill, reminding me of deep mines and gloomy crypts, such a chill as I had experienced that very morning. The next moment, close to the net, I saw a ball rebound in mid-air in empty space, and at the same instant, a score of feet away, Paul Tyclorn emitted a rainbow flash. It could not be he from whom the ball had rebounded, and with sickening dread I realized that Lloyd Inwood had come upon the scene. To make sure, I looked for his shadow, and there it was, a shapeless blotch the girth of his body, because the sun was overhead. I remembered his threat, and felt sure that all the long years of rivalry were about to culminate in uncanny battle. I cried a warning to Paul, and heard a snarl as of a wild beast, and an answering snarl. I saw the dark blotch move swiftly across the court, and a brilliant burst of vari-coloured light moving with equal swiftness to meet it, and then shadow and flash came together, and there was a sound of unseen blows. The net went down before my frightened eyes. I sprang towards the fighters, crying, "For God's sake!" but their locked bodies smote against my knees, and I was overthrown. "You keep out of this, old man!" I heard the voice of Lloyd Inwood from out of the emptiness, and then Paul's voice crying, "Yes, we've had enough of your peacemaking." From the sound of their voices I knew they had separated. I could not locate Paul, and so approached the shadow that represented Lloyd. But from the other side came a stunning blow on the point of my jaw, and I heard Paul scream angrily, "Now will you keep away?" Then they came together again, the impact of their blows, their groans and gasps, and the swift flashing and shadow movings telling plainly of the deadliness of the struggle. I shouted for help. The Gaffer Bedshaw came running into the court. I could see, as he approached, that he was looking at me strangely, but he collided with the combatants and was hurled headlong to the ground. With despairing shriek and a cry of, "Oh Lord, I've got him!" he sprang to his feet and tore madly out of the court. I could do nothing, so I sat up, fascinated and powerless, and watched the struggle. The noonday sun beat down with dazzling brightness on the naked tennis court, and it was naked. All I could see was the blotch of shadow and the rainbow flashes, the dust rising from the invisible feet, the earth tearing up from beneath the straining foot grips, and the wire screen bulge once or twice as the bodies hurled against it. And that was all, and after a time even that ceased. There were no more flashes, and the shadow had become long and stationary, and I remembered their set boyish faces when they clung to the roots in the deep coolness of the pool. They found me an hour afterward. Some inkling of what had happened got to the servants, and they quitted the Tyclorn service in a body. Gaffer Bedshaw never recovered from the second shock he received, and is confined in a madhouse, hopelessly incurable. The secrets of their marvellous discoveries died with Paul and Lloyd, both laboratories being destroyed by grief-stricken relatives. As for myself, I no longer care for chemical research, and science is a tabooed topic in my household. I've returned to my roses. Nature's colours are good enough for me.
Tell me, gang, how did you feel about this story?
Pretty good. I like it more when I engage on it. I engage with it on a metaphorical level rather than a literal one.
Ooh, what does that
I
mean?
enjoyed it. Yeah, but what does that mean, Matt?
Well, the science is a bit weird.
Is it even science?
No, well, it's based in science, but taken in a direction that is not science, which I guess a lot of science fiction is, but it's like very obvious in this case, is maybe what I mean.
I mean, it's soft science that probably didn't stand, but it was also published quite some time ago, so
When was
I
it
don't know.
published?
It's very comic book logic, isn't it?
It is.
1902.
Yeah, that is quite a long time ago, so maybe it's more easily forgivable.
Wouldn't have been very much science fiction around at that point to draw from.
Scientific method was still relatively young. You can cut them some slack. I liked the strange rivalry. I don't know, it was different to see two characters whose, I don't know, they're pit so directly against each other and neither of them is necessarily right. They're very equal.
I quite liked that.
It immediately injects, I think, a sense of kind of tension and stakes into the story. That's quite fun to get behind when the characters care so deeply about their rivalry. And it gives them a reason to continue interacting as well, which is always useful.
Did you like how they did the rivalry in the story?
Yeah, I mean, as with any rivalry or any short story, I always want them to dig in deeper. And I want to know why they were rivals in the first place and, like, get all the tension scenes where they're just together on their own without their random friendly friend with them. But, like, you know, other than that, I enjoyed the rivalry.
That's good, because it's kind of the hook, I think, that drags you into the story. So the first thing I was interested in was why are these guys so dedicated to one-upping each other to the point that they, like, almost drown?
That question doesn't get an answer, does it?
It does not. They kind of try and say it's because, oh, maybe they have some resentment because they both liked the same girl, and she was like, I can't possibly choose between you.
Rivalry, the drowning thing happened before that, didn't they?
They did have an intense rivalry before that moment.
But then there's a sense that their rivalry, they always had one, but it didn't get so bitter until after the woman rejected them both.
But then again, like, almost drowning is still pretty hardcore, and that's before anything to do with a woman.
Yeah, it's hardcore, but it's also not them, like, you know, actively trying to kill each other. It's just their own stupidity.
Just, I liked that little anecdote as a way to portray their relationship with each other early in the story.
Yes, it does a good job of setting it up. It also made me laugh how the main character introduced themselves as, and the friend was me.
He's very resigned. He's like, the lucky chap, it was I, almost in tone, like he's the one stuck trying to mediate between them all the time.
He's very self-deprecating, but he definitely came out of it the best.
I thought it was interesting to tell the story from his perspective rather than either of the rivals, because it doesn't really put you on either one of their sides.
He's very unbiased. It's kind of built into his character. He's the mediator.
I mean, also the only way you can see both sides of their sciencey experiment, isn't it? If he's the only one getting told.
I guess they wouldn't share scientific secrets with each other, unless it was in like a boasting kind of way.
Or the we used to be friends and then you betrayed me kind of rivalry.
We talked a bit earlier about the quote science in this story, and the first time I read it, I thought, okay, it's quite earnest. It's going into a lot of detail about the way light works. Like, he's put some effort into this. And then I kind of read it again and went, I think he's just messing with us. Especially when it comes to joking about that man who is like practically invisible because his skin is so dark, which I guess is kind of a racist joke. But also,
I mean, he could have just been racist.
It's true, but like, I don't know, it just came across as a bit ridiculous to me.
The part about this is how light works is true. The part about if you make a black so dark it will become invisible is clearly nonsense, because you would see the outline, you'd see the shadow. It wouldn't blur your vision when you looked at it.
I mean, that's the point they make, isn't it? I mean, they make the point that you'd always see the shadow.
But then they also have weird sections where he's like, oh, I couldn't see the guy because he was so black. I'm like, well, obviously you can see his shadow. And then there's parts where he's looking at the paint and he's like, oh, I can't look at it directly. It's like my vision blurs. I'm like, that's obviously nonsense.
I think Jack London was a bit of a troll, and I think he's just like messing with us to see if we believe it.
I think maybe there's just some artsy hand waving going on because the invisibility thing is a really nice metaphor, and I think that's why it's there.
Ooh, tell us more about the metaphor.
The reason that the ending works, I guess, and the reason why I think he picked invisibility as the thing these two are competing over at the end is because to me it's kind of saying how they're trying so hard to outdo each other that that's all that they are, and it kind of erases their whole identity, and in the end they kind of just cancel each other out, right? Like they are literally turning themselves into nothing in an attempt to outdo the other.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That
kinda
seems
makes
right.
sense.
I think that's why he chose the invisibility. And also, there's this nice aspect where they go about it in two obviously contrasting ways. Like, they have opposite approaches that end up on the same result, and that's quite a nice aspect of it as well. So I think those are the reasons why he went for the invisibility thing, and then he kind of backwards engineered some slightly nonsensical science explanation.
I did enjoy the nonsense science, I must say.
Any of you guys heard of the whole Blackest Black
Yeah.
paint drama in the art
Venta
community?
Black.
That's what this story made me think of. So, an artist called Anish Kapoor, however you pronounce that, made a pigment of black they called the Blackest Black. Like I think it was Vanta Black, and he's made it so that he was the only like artist in the world who was allowed to use that particular shade of black that was darker than any we'd seen before. And this other artist guy, Stuart Semple, then proceeded to mock it and make other like colors that everyone except Anish Kapoor is allowed to use and things like that. And it all kind of escalated. Now they've got some kind of rivalry thing going on where they're just making colors.
Semple's most famous one is the pinkest pink.
Yes, which he posted on Instagram.
How the hell does this? Surely you can't have a color as intellectual property.
That's what the argument was about,
right?
Basically.
Yeah, it goes into things like the like gentrification of art and.
Yeah, I think there was a really good Reddit thread about it I read ages ago. I'll see if I can dig it out a bit later.
Yeah, it's not particularly relevant to the story. The darkest of the dark blacks made me think of it.
It kind of is because
I mean, it was a rivalry, and it was to do with the Blackest Black.
Exactly. I think it's very relevant. They are the real life versions of the characters in this story. I just hope they won't cancel each other out, I guess. Okay, so this story has some kind of scientific fact, as Matt has explained to us. I'm not sure it uses it effectively. I guess it does. Does it? I don't know. I mean, it used it to the effect that I was amused by it.
The science is a means to an end in the story. It's definitely not the point of it.
It does what it narratively needs to do. It's just not convincing science.
If you were going to use science in stories, would you take this approach, or would you want it to be a bit more believable?
Fantasy is just making up nonsense. It's a whole genre of just making up nonsense. And it's not terrible. I enjoy it. Science fiction varies a lot anyway in terms of how accurate it is. Okay, so if you were going to use some science in a story, how would you do it effectively, do you think? I hate to tell you it depends, because that's the answer to every question. But it depends what your objective is. Like in this story, you just needed something to explain this weird metaphor and the narrative that you'd set up, so we use science in this way. You might set out to write a story because you find some cool fact about, I don't know, a certain type of armadillo. And you're like, I don't know, this would be a really cool story. I'm going to write a story about this armadillo. And I don't know why I picked that. That's such a horrible example. Why? What's wrong with armadillos? What about armadillos? Well, maybe you could make like armadillo people who have some kind of characteristics that armadillos do. They eat bugs and they roll up into balls. And that's an interesting way of building some actual science into your story, because you're taking something that's definitely a fantasy element and you've used real facts about what armadillos are really like. Yeah, I really liked Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant, which is about mermaids, but she goes a lot into the science of how a creature would communicate underwater. So they use sign language and what they need to survive, so what they eat and things like that, which informs how they look, what their teeth look like, all that kind of stuff. And that made the book really interesting because it gave us this undertone of
this could be real.
Helps to take the more abstract or fantastical parts of your story and make us really believe in them. I do this a lot in fantasy where I have a very fantastical world, but I don't use magic or anything very often, and a lot of how conflicts are resolved in my stories is basically just physics, and I try and adhere to.
Physics is basically magic.
Yeah, it can be, but it's a system that's you don't need to explain, and everyone understands, kind of, to some extent.
Varying extents.
Yeah, but the novel I'm working on right now is about people who construct wings and can fly, and by sticking to science, that has led me to some interesting points of world building of like, what materials do they make these things out of? Do you have to be of a certain body type to use them? And I can do all this calculation, and nobody needs to know that I'm using a slightly lower value of acceleration due to gravity to make the physics of my story work. You understand that a person can fly, and then when they crash into things, it will hurt.
All right, I don't know if this question is as relevant now because we kind of talked about it, but I really liked how the story took that neutral stance through a third POV, because usually, like in this kind of setup, you have one character who is, the one you're rooting for, the good character, and one who is not so good, maybe even evil, depending on the story. But this story is different in that it doesn't really say this is the guy you want to root for. Did you like this? What did you think about it?
It works for the story it was telling, but it's not what I would personally do. Because I would want to get more into the rivalry, and using a neutral third person prevents that. Like, it would be more interesting being at the bottom of the lake, terrified you're going to drown, but also refusing to let go, than just, standing at the surface watching the water bubble and not bubble.
Maybe if this was written now, or maybe if it was longer and not a short story, I would definitely do alternating POV for this. So you would get both perspectives that way.
It would be nice to know, like, maybe their rivalry is motivated by slightly different things for each of the characters.
I think if you had an alternating POV, you could show that kind of push and pull a little bit more as well, because you could show one character succeeding and then it puts the other in a situation where they're really not happy with what's going on, so then they have to bounce back from that.
Yeah. And also how much they, like, kind of bounce off each other's ideas as well. That's an interesting one. Like, muse and destroy all at once.
You don't really get a sense of how they really react to each other.
Yeah, which I think means you don't get the payoff of the ending as much. But, for a short story, there you go. I basically said what I needed to, that it works for the format it's in and the word count.
I think there is more demand for these kinds of stories where it's not just, here is the person you should root for and here is the person you shouldn't.
I definitely appreciate a good old-fashioned villain versus hero story, but I also like that this story was more like everybody sucks here, I guess, to use the internet terminology.
I mean, it started with people giving their villains kind of either redemption arcs or like decent reasons for what they're doing. They would justify their villainy. But I think the really good stories take it a step further, and it is kind of uncertain who is in the right, and different readers may have different opinions on that. I think it's a very different story when you put it that way, but I think it's a lot more interesting, and I think things are moving this way where we are more interested in exploring different ideas rather than just.
Yeah, I wonder if it's because we consume so many stories now that we need something more, push them further along, let them evolve.
I mean, I also just think our world isn't as black and white anymore, and that's becoming increasingly obvious. Those stories where it is very black and white can be appealing precisely because they don't match our world, but then for other people it's like they want something a little bit closer to what feels true.
We have a more holistic view of how the world works now. We're more informed about a lot of things, and that means that our understanding is a lot more complex. We can't just label things as things that bad people do. You can't just label people as bad anymore. Like there's a lot more to everything.
I think it's good that we've moved this way. We've become more empathetic. That's the word.
Yeah.
And personally, I don't feel any tension is lost just because even if I'm slightly on the fence between which of the two sides is in the right, I'm still tense because I want to know which one is going to come out on top or what's going to happen to the characters involved, I don't think you really lose anything in terms of the tension.
I almost feel like there's more tension and it's more exciting because you don't know who's going to win. Whereas in a traditional hero versus villain, you know probably, unless you're reading like Grimdark or whatever, that the hero is going to win.
More room for the characters to foil and interrogate each other's beliefs as well if they're both somewhere a little bit right and a little bit wrong. Because you can't just dismiss everything that they're saying.
Yeah. So, favorite rivalries in fiction?
Eli and Victor in Vicious.
Yeah, that's a good one. So that's by
Yep.
V. Schwab,
I
isn't
love
it?
my life.
I was going to throw out the classic and say Sherlock or Moriarty.
I got Watson vibes from the narrator of this story, I must say.
You're right.
Like with a more neutral narrator who's not a chemistry genius.
He's just the mayonnaise of the story, making it a little bit. He's making the sandwich come
Right.
together. I don't know where this metaphor was going. Ignore me. He's unobtrusive, but still a key ingredient.
Yes. Although mayonnaise is not unobtrusive.
You don't like it?
I despise
Oh,
mayonnaise.
okay. I should have picked something
I
different.
think the narrator is the bread. Because if we didn't have him, we wouldn't have a sandwich because we wouldn't know what was happening. No one would be telling us the story.
You're right. That's much better.
Bread is the medium on which the sandwich is delivered.
I'll leave all future sandwich metaphors to you. All right. So at the end, they just, well, I guess the implication is that they just kill each other, but I do love the image of them fighting because no one can really see it properly. You just see the shadow and the flashes, which I guess is where the title comes from. I was a bit disappointed with the ending because
Feels like a bit of a cop-out, doesn't it?
I mean, it was foreshadowed,
it
though.
was, but I wanted them to understand that each of them were geniuses and they could both be geniuses
Right.
in their own different
That's why
way.
it's slightly unsatisfying, because it shows absolutely no growth on their part since they almost drowned.
I guess the other thing would have been if one of them came out on top, which would have been a surprise, really. But I'm glad they didn't do that at the same time.
That's not a good ending to a story. That's a really good mid-turn point. Like your twist in the middle is that one of them succeeds and then you follow them for the rest of the story. That's good. Having one of them win is not a good ending.
Yeah. Or if it is, and it's about what is the cost of winning.
Yeah, that's a good
What
point.
did you
could play it
lose?
that way.
What did you sacrifice to win? Which it will obviously be something to do with the rival.
Oh, I'm glad you had a good time. I had a good time. But still occasionally go, was that a real story? Did I just read that? All right. Thank you for listening. Please leave a comment on our website, theshortstoryworkshop.com, to let us know what you thought. You can also find all our previous short stories and episodes. We'll be back with another story in a couple of weeks. Goodbye.